All right, so this is your video that goes along with your virus guided notes. You should complete those while you are going through this. So what are viruses? You've got this, it's number 1 in your notes. It says that they are very small infectious agents that replicate inside the living cells of an organism. So when we say something's infectious, we mean that it can be caught between organisms. So that means an infectious agent would mean that if one human has it, then it's possible that they could spread it to you. And we know this about viruses. Essentially, what we're going to look at with viruses is we're going to look at treatment. Now, we call the preventative measure that we have in medicine for viruses are your vaccines. So vaccines are something that you would take before you are exposed to a virus. And we have quite a few of them. So we know that there's a schedule that children go through where they get vaccines as they're growing up for things like measles, they get things for chickenpox, but we don't have vaccines for all viruses. And the question we're going to look at is why? Why is it that we've developed vaccines for some but not others? In order to understand this, we need to know a little bit about the biology of viruses. So we're going to look at what are they, how they affect our cells, and then we're going to look at vaccines and how they work. Number 2 just asks you for examples. Now I tried to grab a range of viruses from the really common, for example, the rhinovirus, which is your common cold. Everybody's had a cold before in their life. That is a virus that attacks your respiratory system. So that's why when you think about what do you feel like when you have a cold, well, your nose is running, your throat hurts. Again, respiratory system. Then we have influenza. So that's the common flu the seasonal flu. And that's caused by a virus. We have less common ones like HIV and Ebola. HIV is the human immunovirus. People tend to get HIV/AIDS confused. HIV is the name of the virus. AIDS is the name of the condition. So if you have enough HIV, enough virus inside your blood, then we say that you have AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. But HIV is the name of the virus. Ebola, measles. Measles is something that people are commonly vaccinated against. And rabies, again, this is something that we tend to think of as affecting animals, dogs mostly. But those are all caused by viruses. And then we see over on the right-hand side, we've got some nice pictures of viruses. This right here, this cool guy that you have in the center, this is called a bacteriophage. Phage means eating, and bacteriophage is a virus that eats bacteria. So this is a special virus that's got this really cool shape right here where it's got the little legs, almost looks like a lunar lander. And that is your bacteriophage, a virus that specializes in bacteria. Then we have Ebola. That's your red picture in the bottom right-hand corner. This has the characteristic shepherd's crook. That's what that little knot down at the end is called, and that's how it's identified, or one of the ways it's identified. Then we have some kind of nice, almost like plain-looking viruses. They just look like cells almost, you would imagine just sort of circles. And those are your common cold virus and your measles virus. So one of the cool things about viruses is that they have an incredibly simplistic structure. There's really only 2 things you find in all viruses. And the first thing that you're going to find in all viruses is you're going to find a protein capsid. So think of this as like a protein protective shell that forms around the genetic info. So those are the 2 components, and that's pretty much it. So now you may be thinking to yourself, man, that's so much easier than learning about bacterial, plant, animal cells, and you would be absolutely right, because viruses are not made of cells. All they are is some genetic info with some protein wrapped around it. So they are incredibly simplistic. Now, I intentionally am saying genetic info because one of the cool things about viruses that we did not encounter with our bacteria, plants, animals, fungi, anything else before now, is that, yes, some bacteria, like all those kingdoms, do use DNA to encode their genetic info. But the unique thing about viruses is we have some viruses that use RNA as their genetic info. And this is not just to copy their DNA in order to make proteins. This is actually how they store their genetic info. They store it in RNA. And that's unique to viruses. So no other living thing uses RNA as its information encoding molecule. So as far as how viruses work, so viruses cannot replicate on their own. So looking at their structure, again, it's just genetic info with a protein capsule wrapped around it. Doesn't have ribosomes, doesn't have a Golgi body, doesn't have endoplasmic reticulum. You'll notice it has none of the machinery inside of a cell that we talked about that makes organic molecules. It can't make its own proteins, can't make its own fats. So how does it virus replicate? How does it make more viruses? And this is where we get into how viruses function. Viruses work by taking that DNA or RNA, whatever genetic info they have encased inside that protein capsid, and injecting it into another cell. So if you are a bacteriophage, a bacteria-eating virus, you would inject your DNA or your RNA into a bacteria. Once your DNA is inside there, your DNA essentially hijacks that cell, and it tells the cell you are no longer going to make bacteria proteins, bacteria carbohydrates. You're going to make more viruses. So all of the organelles, all those specialized structures that we had inside of our cells to make things like proteins or make lipids, all of a sudden stop making the cells work, and they start making virus. And so the virus is going to essentially use the cell to replicate itself. So viruses, in order to get inside of a cell, they have the ability to mimic sort of the proteins that you would find on the outside of a cell. And viruses are limited by what they can imitate. So for example, rhinovirus affects humans, but the type of rhinovirus, the type of virus that affects humans would be very different from the one that affects a cat. And that has to do with the fact that proteins, your viruses, in order to fake their way inside of a cell, have to specialize so that they can only fake their way into certain types of cells. So the kind of simplified version of this is, if you imagine that right here over in yellow, this is your cat virus. So on the outside of this virus, it has rounded circles, and this is its sort of faked proteins that it has to get inside the cat cell. But on a human, we would have very different markers to read things. So we notice we get triangles instead of circles. So we notice that if a cat virus were to get inside of a human, it has the wrong markers on the outside to get inside of our cells. So this is why your dog can have a cold and you don't have to worry about catching it. It's because the virus has specialized to affect dog cells, not to affect human cells. Now, when we look at where viruses tend to jump between species, we find that one of the most famous examples of this is that HIV, so human immunovirus, most closely related to something called SIV, which is simian immunovirus. So this is an immune system attacking virus that is found in chimpanzees, which are our closest relatives. So the interesting thing here is that you have your chimpanzee and your humans both suffering from viruses that are very, very closely related. So the question is, if these immunoviruses are able to attack both human and chimp cells, what does that indicate about our white blood cell structure? So if we go back to our cat and human cells, we said we don't catch cat viruses because our cells are very different from one another. So if we look over here, you have chimps and humans catching the same virus, which indicates that we actually are much more similar to each other. And we do find that when you look at the immune system specialized cells of chimps and humans, they have a lot of the same structures, a lot of the same protein markers on them. Again, similar white blood cell membranous protein structures. And this would be examples of common ancestry. So when we look at viruses, we know that they need, in order to replicate themselves, they have to get inside of a host cell. But once they're inside there, once they put their DNA in there, there's actually two different cycles that viruses can go into. There's one that's called the lytic cycle and one called the lysogenic cycle. I think of the lytic cycle as like the cell explosion cycle, because what happens in the lytic cycle is, as soon as, here's your little bacteriophage, and it's attaching onto your bacteria. So you see the single circular chromosome of your bacteria, and then this blue squiggle inside, that protein capsid, that is your viral DNA. So what's going to happen is the virus will inject its blue DNA in here, and then as soon as that DNA is in there, it's going to act like a commander. It's going to tell all of the parts of the cell to stop making what they were making and start making virus. So when we look inside this bacteria, now we can see we've got all the components of a virus starting to be assembled. Then we see the virus is actually getting put together. So the proteins that this bacteria made that were viral proteins, they're going to get assembled to make those little bacteriophages. And then in the lytic cycle, the bacteria actually burst out of the cell and they destroy the cell when they do this. And all these little viruses that were assembled by the cell that actually killed the cell are fully functional. And they'll go find another cell and the cycle goes round and round and round. So the lytic cycle, this bacterial infection that then causes the cell to explode, this explains a lot of your common symptoms that you would have with things like the common cold. So you get virus inside your cells then get destroyed by the virus, so you get things like a sore throat because the virus is attacking all of those cells inside your throat, making them sore. So I'm going to pause here. We'll pick up on video 2, talk about the lysogenic cycle.